This is our last of the three series of 2 Peter. So far, Kevin's talked us through this idea that we need to grow in our faith and our understanding of Jesus and to discern God's calling in our lives. Last week, Gilly shared some context about the people that Peter was writing to and how they were struggling with the transition from first generation Christians, people who had known Jesus personally, into the second generation of Christians, people who weren't around during that time, and how in that context there was some false teachers, and the encouragement of Peter was to discern what is right and wrong. Just don't hear and take on everything people say. Think about what they're saying and discern the right and wrong. In both these sermons that Kevin and Gilly did, despite the challenges that Peter was highlighting in his letter, there's also these beautiful encouragements in the letter as well, to connect with God, to grow closer with God, to come, to recognise the blessings that come with our relationship with Jesus. You know, how did Gilly describe it last week? We are witnesses to the majesty of the things that are happening around us. Today's sermon's a bit the same. There's some difficult parts in this reading, and we'll try and address them. But there's also, in amongst that, some really great encouragement that I want to highlight as well, especially when we're talking about this issue of the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. So Gilly was explaining that transition from first generation to second generation Christians. And when it comes to this topic, it was particularly tricky because the early church had this idea that Jesus was returning soon, like real soon, like then. They had this idea that Jesus was coming then. And there was lots of reasons why they were justified in that thinking. See, in Acts chapter 1, when Jesus went back up to heaven, what did the two angels say? Jesus is coming back down again the same way as he's gone up. So you've got to be prepared for that. In John 14, Jesus said, and this is just one of the numerous references that he does, that he's going to prepare a place for us, and then he will come back and take us to be with him forever. There's all these references that Jesus gives about coming back. Paul, John, Peter, Titus, the writer of Hebrews, they all mention this idea of Jesus coming again. And so the church was thinking, all right, well, Jesus is coming again. But they also believed it was imminent, that it was going to happen really soon. And that came from a statement of Jesus in Matthew 24:34, when Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Jesus is saying there are some people here who are still going to be around when all these things happen. But this is the problem with 2 Peter that Peter was trying to address. Because, as Gilly pointed out and as Kevin pointed out, 2 Peter's written 35 years after Jesus. That generation is starting to die out. And so the people were starting to ask, well, what happened to that promise when Jesus said that all these things will happen while some of this generation will still be alive? They're going, it's not happening. What's happened to this coming of Jesus again? Is it real? What does it mean to understand the day of the Lord if the day of the Lord has been delayed? And okay, so Peter does come up with some interesting ways of addressing that. He talks about Psalm 90 verse 4 where, we are told that to God a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. And so therefore, when we're saying it's going to happen imminently, it could happen any time in the next 1,000 years. He also, Peter says, well, maybe God's being patient and giving the most opportunity for everybody to respond before Jesus returns. Both of those sound reasonable, don't they? But we are now 2,000 years after Jesus made that comment. And I don't know, are we starting to ask the same question that the people of Peter's time were asking? Is this supposed to be something that's literal? If Jesus is coming back imminently, it's 2,000 years now. Is Jesus coming back? Is Jesus coming back soon? I don't know if you think of these questions, but today I want to put up 3 questions that I think will be helpful in breaking down this topic. So I've got, how do we understand the return of Jesus? I've got, how do we understand the destruction of the world that Peter talks about in our Bible reading today? Because that's a difficult part of our Bible reading. And the last question is, how do we be ready for the day of the Lord? Do those questions sound all right? Anybody else want to add any more questions in? No? Are you all ready for this? That's the whole point of John's talk, We have to be ready for this, yes? Yes? All right, let's jump in. How do we understand the day of the Lord? Any of us who grew up in the 80s or 90s or the noughties had a very particular teaching on the day of the Lord that was very much influenced by that book on the screen, the Left Behind books. Did anyone read that series? A few nods. Didn't it get up this way? It was huge. Like, biggest Christian book for... Anyway. The point is that they taught a very particular way of understanding the day of the Lord. They taught that there was a pattern that comes through the Bible, where there would be a rapture of believers, that there would be the end times, the rise of the Antichrist, the coming of Jesus' glory, the final battle, and part of the final battle, the earth would be destroyed. But that's okay, because God is creating a new heaven and a new earth for all the believers to live in. Have you heard that sort of an outline before? Yeah? So that's what I grew up with, that sort of an understanding that is what the end times is all about. That is a legitimate way of understanding it, don't get me wrong. But I don't think that's the only way of trying to understand what the end times or this idea of Jesus coming again is all about. You see, one of the difficulties that the church and Christians have had over the last 2,000 years really wrestled with this idea of the return of Jesus is, how do we put the return of Jesus next to a verse like Matthew 28:30, when Jesus promises to be with us always? If Jesus is already with us, then what do we mean when we say Jesus is returning? Because Jesus is already here. Has anyone spoken to Jesus in the last week? Has anyone felt Jesus' presence surrounding them in the last week? Then what do we mean about Jesus coming again? Jesus is already with us. Can you see that tension? And so, some people might go, all right, well, we're talking Jesus is going to return physically. That's the difference. The second coming is Jesus is physically going to be here. But some people are exploring the ideas that maybe the return of Jesus is more about the establishment of the kingdom of God than the physical presence of Jesus in bodily form. Did you get that statement? Let me break that down a bit. You see, maybe the day of the Lord is when the world realizes and embraces the way of Jesus, and that this way of Jesus brings life and brings peace and brings, the love and the joy and the hope and the peace that comes with this way of living. Maybe the day of the Lord is that day when every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. If that's the day of the Lord, that's not necessarily about a day of Jesus physically appearing, but a day when the world begins to realize that this is the way. And maybe the day of the Lord doesn't come through a particular point where God says, all right, Jesus, time to jump on your horse and go back. But the day of the Lord comes about when we as followers of Jesus get our act together and help the world see what is true. Can you see that's just a different way of looking at this? I'm not necessarily one's right and one's wrong. And maybe, to be honest, the day of the Lord is probably a little bit of both. I think I didn't press click when I should have. That maybe the day of the Lord is a little bit of both. I'm just putting forward some ideas for you to ponder and to wrestle with that the church has been wrestling with for 2,000 years. But let's turn our attention to the tricky part that's particularly in 2 Peter. Because 2 Peter, and especially the verses we jumped over, read the whole chapter 3, is all about the destruction of the world at the end times. That the world does not survive. It gets wiped out. And how do we understand that one? In particular, the verse in our Bible reading was, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare." That's pretty stark, isn't it? If you think, oh, maybe that's just an obscure verse, no, Peter says the same thing in verses 7, 11, and 12 in chapter 3. So it's this idea that at the end times, everything gets destroyed. If we go back to the Left Behind sort of imagery that I grew up with, it's because at the end battle, good and evil are battling out, and that's what ultimately destroys the world when Jesus comes in glory. I read some other articles during the week that sort of says, well, scientifically, this isn't wrong. Our sun is slowly expanding. And there will be some point in the future, billions of years in the future, where the sun will destroy our earth. Scientifically, that is true. And so is that what it's talking about? That there will be a destruction of the world at some point? Or I've read an article that talked about that maybe Peter is being prophetically referring to climate change. Look at verse 11 there, where it says that everything will be destroyed in the heat. Has God given him a bit of an idea that at some point things are going to be overheating here, and that's going to be leading to the destruction of the world? I don't know. I'm just raising some interesting ideas that I've been reading this week. But there is a problem with this part of the reading in 2 Peter. I and a lot of theologians and scholars have struggled with, if there is the destruction of the world at the end times, then what does that mean when it comes to our understanding of environmentalism? Or in short, what's the point of caring for the earth now if it's all going to be destroyed anyway? What's the point of being a good steward of God's creation if it's God's plan to destroy it? If God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth, then why is it wrong to plunder the earth for everything that we can now? Who cares about what implications that has if God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth? After all, if we are plundering it, wouldn't we be helping God achieve God's plan? Can you see where we're coming from here? Who's uncomfortable with this sort of thinking? There are some people who think this, by the way. But yeah, theologians have really struggled with this, going, I'm not sure if I like this idea of the destruction of the world because it doesn't align with this idea of how we're supposed to care for the world. I don't believe it's God's plan necessarily to destruct the world. I sit more comfortably with, in the Old Testament there's some really good imagery of what this new heaven and this new earth means for us. Actually, it's also in Judaism as well. In the Old Testament, they talk about, yes, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, but that doesn't come about through the destruction of the current earth. It comes about through the renewing of the earth. The renewing of the earth. That God is renewing all of creation and inviting us to be part of that renewing process as well. Gilly talked about the eighth day, is part of what the eighth day about the renewing of God's creation. Look, I would probably agree with the statement, is the world on a path to destruction? Probably yes. But Peter is right in verse 13 where he says, we are looking forward to a day where there will be this new heaven and this new earth. But can you see what I did in that Bible reading up there? If I just change the words to, we are looking forward to a renewed heaven and a renewed earth, that we are part of that process. Psalm 104 talks about this prayer where we're inviting the Holy Spirit to renew all of creation. If we have this idea, then we are already living in the new heaven and the new earth. We're just being called to participate in bringing about that vision into a reality. We are called as God's stewards to work with God to renew this earth, which is why caring for this earth is so important, because it's part of God's plan to renew the earth. How are we going with this? Is this all a bit over the place? I know I'm just throwing out ideas and not necessarily picking up the threads afterwards. Let's jump to the last question then. What does it mean to be ready for the day of the Lord? Well, I guess it depends how we've answered the first two questions, doesn't it? This is a very broad question of what it might mean to be ready. Paul in verse 10 says that the day of the Lord will come like a thief. Verse 17 says we should be on our guard or to be ready. Gilly said last week we need to be alert and of sober mind. So what does it mean to be ready? I think I would have started off by saying it doesn't mean that we need to live in fear of the day of the Lord. I don't think that's the point at all that Peter's trying to make. I remember growing up in the Left Behind era that I did in my late teenage years have this fear of the rapture and everything. That I would live in fear, especially I would think that I would sin and then the rapture would happen before I had a chance to confess my sins and I'd be left behind. And I don't think Peter's talking about we need to live in fear of all this happening. Being ready is not about living in fear. That's not helpful. But Peter does give us a list of things in our Bible reading. This is the encouragement part I said that's going to come. A list of things that is helpful for us in being ready, whatever we understand the day of the Lord to be. And so he talked about things like we need to reflect on the words of encouragement given by Jesus and the prophets in verse 2. He says that we should live godly lives and live in a way that honours God. We should be at peace with God and be settled in our relationship with Jesus. And in verse 18 he talks about we need to grow in the grace and the knowledge of Jesus. That's not a bad list, is it? Actually, I would add another one in there, just of what we were talking before, that I actually think that being ready for the day of the Lord is participating with God in the renewing of all of creation as well. It's standing against the things that are bringing destruction of the world or to people's lives, and it's being a vessel in which God can bring heaven to earth. To me, that's a pretty comprehensive list for us to start on. If we want to be ready for the day of the Lord, whatever we understand it to be, maybe we can just start with those 5 things and implement those in our lives. It's probably a good spot to end the sermon, and I still haven't brought the threads together. It's one of these things, if you want to keep talking over morning tea, ask questions during the week. I don't understand this. How do we handle something like this? Or what about this Bible verse? Let's keep talking. But for now, let's finish and let's say amen to everything that God has brought to us this morning.